For the context of this talk, what I'm interpreting DevOps is a way of working where the ultimate aim is to get rid of this idea that developers just develop code and then throw it over the wall for somebody else to deal with henceforth. It's this idea that developers are part of the process of something that users use. They see it not just from developing code right at the start, but they see it through its whole lifetime. And this idea that it's not just tools, it's not just processes, it's not just organizational structures, there's lots of things that fall into it. I'm gonna be a little bit lazy with the language actually throughout, so I might say DevOps, I might say agile or continuous delivery. For me, it's just these ideas of some different ways of developing software that are a little bit different to the traditional, typically waterfall IT ideas of developing software, where you gather all the requirements, then you develop, then it goes into production, and then it's somebody else's project. And I'm particularly talking about enterprise organizations because that's where I've got my experience, and it's part of some of the challenges that I've seen. Thank you, Matthew, for doing the show of hands of the different skill sets in the room, but is there anybody here that works at a startup? Anyone that works at what you say a large organisation? Lots of different departments. I think there's a few students as well. If at any point I'm using language that you don't understand or I start throwing acronyms in, feel free to put your hand up and just ask me to explain, because sometimes when you get a bit wrapped up in the context, you forget that not everybody uses the same glossary, so please do just jump in. So, I'm just going to talk about my journey, because I think especially for the students that are in the room, it might be quite interesting to know about different careers in IT. So, I did a degree which was half computer science and half accounting. I don't know why I picked half accounting. Bit of an accident, and quickly changed my mind on that. But I ended up at the co-op because it offered a one-year placement in IT, and that sounded quite interesting because I didn't really want to commit to anything because I might go travelling. And this sounded like a really, really broad IT role. So I did that and moved around lots of different areas. And all the things that I'd done at uni, what I saw in the job was quite different. And I ended up falling into a sector called service management. So this is essentially, once the service that you've created is up and running, service management is a team that looks after what happens when it breaks, what happens when you want to change it, what happens with bugs, how do you make sure that that service is always improving. So I didn't know that existed, and it's something that I, for my sins, am still doing now. So I joined the co-op 8 years ago, and now I've sort of progressed through different roles, and I'm working in our new digital department. So we have our main IT teams who run most of our systems. So co-op's got food stores, funeral branches, insurance, legal services, and they're mostly run out of on-premise data centres with tin in rooms. This new digital team that formed wanted to work in a different way. So the idea was that it wanted to use DevOps principles, agile methodologies, it wanted to use the cloud, it wanted to make use of all these different things. So I somehow ended up in this team, and we were right in the middle of launching the biggest new software release that we've done in quite a long time. We used to, once upon a time, have in-house software development. We had a change of strategy somewhere along that journey, and we decided that we wanted to buy rather than build. And then this digital team that came along, we decided actually we want to build again. We want to have something that gives us a competitive edge, so we need to build. What this meant was, when I joined, we were already developing this membership service, and I had to get up to speed really, really quickly with how does continuous delivery and agile and DevOps work. I had no experience of it, I wasn't a software developer, so I had quite a quick learning journey. And the reason why I think it's important is because I think there's probably other people that work at companies where you worked in a certain way, and then someone goes to a conference, comes back with lots of ideas and says we should do DevOps, and then start to work out, right, okay, sounds good, how do we actually apply it? That's the position I was in. And there's sort of two hats that I wear at the moment. One of them is I look after our digital service management team, so that's the team that looks after incident management, change management, problem management, continuous improvement, bit of supply management. And then the other hat that I wear is I head up our tech operations team. So that's a team that looks after the shared tools, processes, patterns, governance that any of our digital product teams that are developing services can use. So that's things like code repositories or penetration testing software, things like that that everybody can make use of. And the other thing that we do is we develop patterns, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I think just to give you a bit of context around co-op and our journey, So Co-op has been around for a long time. It was formed in 1844, and over the many, many years, there's been lots of mergers and acquisitions, and parts of the company have left and we've acquired new parts. And you can really tell that when you look at our IT systems. There's a hodgepodge of different bits and bobs and infrastructure and varying levels of maintenance and, you know, those lovely legacy but systems that people are afraid to reboot. And the teams that have to support that have got to deal with those challenges. And like I said, once upon a time we did have an in-house development team and we did have our policies and processes written around in-house development. Once we stopped doing that, they became less well established in our ways of working. So as Co-op started to build its digital team that was going to do internal development, suddenly we were lacking a little bit of detail in our policies and processes to really give us what we needed to be able to hit the ground running. We had to start to recreate some of that stuff. So we launched our first service in 2016, and it was a huge, huge moment for us because it was the first great big software project on time, on budget, did what it was meant to, and it was like one of those nice success stories, and it was great to be part of it. And then since then, we've done quite a lot of new product launches. So we launched a new platform for our websites, for our branch and store finders. We've got another big success story, which is a product called Guardian, which is in our funeral branches. Every funeral requires about this much paperwork, and it digitises that and makes it much easier to get management information out of. It takes away a lot of duplication. You can read about these things on our blog if you're interested. And then this year, we launched a new product called Shifts, which really simple thing, but it allows our colleagues in stores to be able to view their shifts on their phone rather than having to wait for their manager to print out the rota for the next 2 weeks. Really simple, but really life-changing for those colleagues. So lots and lots of new products in quite a short space of time. There's more than I've got on here. But now what we've got to do is we've got to continue developing new products, but also maintaining the ones that we've got. And we're also looking at these new technologies that are coming out now, like serverless and containers, and how can they start to integrate with the things that we've built. So I'm going to talk about, why the topic for this talk. So when I was trying to work out what on earth DevOps was and what am I meant to be doing in this role and how does all my traditional IT service management knowledge relate into this new world, I realised that there's a bit of a clash of cultures. There was this traditional waterfall IT that had really thick documented processes and it was quite structured. And then there was these DevOps teams who seemed to do everything by post-it note on the wall. And there was quite a clash in these ways of working, and I could not work out how do I make them see eye to eye. Do I need to? Is one better than the other? Where do I fit? And when I was doing lots of research, I found lots of great talks and interesting articles and things like that, but I couldn't quite work out how to make them apply to an enterprise organisation where you still need to be compliant with PCI DSS regulation and things like that. It seemed really good if you were a greenfield startup company that you could grab Spotify's team structure model and start to put it into place, but actually there was not so much that said, how do you start to take aspects of these, how do you build the culture, and how do you get people on board with it? So this talk's not going to be about why you should do DevOps or how to do DevOps, but I found that when I've gone to other conferences, the bits that I found most useful are where you're having a coffee with someone after they've done the talk, and you're just chatting about the challenges that they have, and you realise that, oh gosh, it's not just us that's struggling with that, maybe everyone's having the same challenge. And maybe you glean little bits of knowledge that you can take back and try, or you can go, actually, Google is struggling with that as well, it's not just us, so let's see what we can do. So I thought I would share a couple of my challenges, I say my rather than ours, because maybe everyone doesn't think the same way as me, but a couple of my challenges, things that I've learned, things that might just signpost you in different areas for challenges that you might be having. Because I don't think we're the only organisation that's decided that they're going to do digital and do DevOps. So I've picked 3 topics, a technical one, a process one, and a cultural one. So this, depending on what you do, hopefully there's something that sounds interesting. First challenge was the speed of launching new services that was expected from our new digital product teams. So they had this idea that they would be able to spin up a prototype in days, launch it as a new service in weeks, months at most, but that was the speed that we were expecting. I was used to, maybe we'll do 2 releases a year and cross our fingers and hope, so completely different world. Second challenge was change management. So I'd come from Maybe we do 5 changes a week on a like really busy week. The teams that I was now working with, they wanted to be doing 10 a day, completely different pace. And lastly, we have when not everyone in the organisation is working in the same way and they're using different terminology and they've got different expectations of each other. So I'm going to deep dive into the first one. So when this digital team was established, the really big driver at the beginning was that we need to show that we can deliver value back to customers quickly. This idea of agile delivery was that we should put something out there that's the bare bones, test if it works, if it's good, let's iterate on it and carry on. If it's not good, throw it away. To do that, you need to be able to get infrastructure and things out in front of users really quickly. You can't say, I think we've got an idea, but there's a 6-month lead time to get it out there. So we needed to change. The idea was to create these minimal viable products, and the product teams wanted to do it quickly. And if we couldn't provide the infrastructure, they would find things like Heroku and go and do it themselves. And I don't know if there's anybody else that's in operations, but part of my job seems to be catching things that have been bought on credit card and bringing them back in a little bit. So we had to be able to help them do that. But at the same time, we needed to balance this demand of you can work quickly, but there's some things that you really shouldn't compromise. So just going back to Tamara and talk about security. You don't want to put something out there quick that's going to collect users' data and doesn't capture it securely. And then you've got something out there with your brand on it and you've just lost a load of data because someone was trying to test if something works. So we had to find this balance. And that's not to say that everything that we built had to be gold-plated production ready, but we needed to make an educated choice around what was the minimum standard that we would let out the door in front of people, and at what point would we need to dial up how much control we're putting around security and supply procurement and things like that. The other thing that was quite important was we knew that we would be spinning up a lot of these alphas and prototypes, and a number of them would turn into live production services. We didn't have enough support people and a big enough on-call rota to scale that every time we had a new service, we added a new person on the support rota. It needed to not scale linearly. We needed to work out how can we make use of economies of scale, but also how can we get rid of any manual, labour-intensive processes in supporting those services. I'm going to use the term pattern a little bit loosely and talk through a few different ones because it can be used quite interchangeably. But I'll go through some examples, and the intention of using patterns was this. If we create something at the start that fits most of our users' product teams' needs, then every time they create a new service, they don't have to recreate the wheel on the really basic things. So if we can say, your basic infrastructure looks like this, and if you want to create a new service, use this, because it's mostly right. And if you need to do something a little bit different, let's talk about the little bit different. But most of it's there if you use the pattern. The idea was that every time you use a pattern, you spend the time creating it once and getting it right, and you iterate on that. But the uses of it should be quicker and quicker. And it also meant that we had consistency. Consistency in our architecture, consistency in the technology, consistency in naming conventions. And the reason why that consistency is really important is the way that we're structured. We have lots of product teams and an on-call team which is shared across all those product teams. During the day, those people in that on-call team, they sit within each product team. So they might be a platform engineer that looks after our cloud services, or they might be a service analyst who's doing the support for that service. And during the day job, they're really specialised in their product. But when it's 3 o'clock in the morning, they're now supporting all of them. If we don't have that consistency, it means that they need to know each one in detail. But because we've got that familiar architecture and familiar technology, it means that once you understand that basic level, you can probably work out the rest of the details. Because test environment in that product means the same as test environment in that product. So it's really easy for one person to be able to logically work their way through the architecture and what's gone wrong in the system, because they know where to find things, they know what to expect. And what we've managed to find so far is using patterns actually, it doesn't restrict people, because we don't say you have to use a pattern. We just say it's much easier for you if you use the pattern. And if you want to do something different, come and talk to us about it. So it gets this balance of flexibility and consistency without preventing people who want it for a good reason do something different, they can still do that. They've still got the flexibility. So I'll show you a few patterns. This is an environment for a product or service. So every product or service that we build follows this pattern. Essentially, there's a management layer up at the top, and then we have two, in this case, AWS accounts. One is production, one is development. That means there's a separate account, a separate hard barrier around all the dev stuff and all the prod stuff. So we've got that segregation of duties and segregation of the worlds, because you might not want to have the same data across both. Everything goes through a little management layer. You've got jump box, you've got rundeck for maintenance jobs, Jenkins for automated deployment, and then down at the bottom layer you can see that we've got different VPCs that are segregating, putting security groups around different aspects of the service. All our databases have got a master and slave and replicated across availability zones. I could go into lots of detail on it, but essentially what this is showing us is that if you follow the pattern, you get things like high availability, databases that are replicated. You can think of these as 3 data centres in Dublin. And those instances there are servers. And the way that this works is that load balancer has some configuration that says if one of those 3 orange squares is looking unhealthy, bring up another one. So if it starts running out of memory or CPU or it's just misbehaving, just bring up another one. If we start, so let's say the service gets really busy and everything's running a bit high, it notices that and adds more servers. So building in a pattern like this means that actually we can deploy with 0 downtime. We know that services can scale if that's what they should do, and that it's less likely that a server running out of memory at 3 o'clock in the morning is going to cause us to need to call an engineer out to fix it, because there's this auto healing baked in. So we do that, and it's a bit of upfront investment, but it does mean that the supportability of the services is easier in the long run. And teams that decide to use that, we're more likely to say, yes, we will take on your on-call support 24/7 because you've used this pattern, therefore we're happier to take it on because you probably not need to be called out for basic things that should be avoided. This last pattern is a little bit different. So this is a pattern for how we do automated deployments through our environment. So the writing's a little bit small, but essentially we've got those same 2 accounts, our development and our production account, and it's showing that we use a tool called Jenkins to grab our code from our Git repository, and the code has to go through dev, QA, pre-prod and prod. It's a bit old, we actually have less environments now. But the reason why we use a pattern for this as well is if every product team deploys their code in the same way, then at 3 o'clock in the morning when there's someone on call going, the team deployed today, that might be related to the outage we're having right now. I'll just go and check the logs and see what actually happened. They know what the deployment pipeline looks like, they know what tools to go and look for, they know what the naming convention will be. So if everyone's deploying in the same way, they know where to go and look, and it just gets rid of some of the complexity of having to delve into documentation to figure out where to look. And one of the benefits of this is that it makes it easier to onboard a new service. So onboarding a new service is when it's ready for it to be taken into 24/7 support. So it's got through those stages of going, is this the right service to build? It's been tested, yes, we're going to keep going with it, and it's going to live for a long time. What we want to do is we want to say that by the time it gets to that point, a number of things should be true. So this is an example of our readiness checklist. And the way we use it is, it's not really a thing at the end of development where we say, you're doing development, now let's check if you've done a good job. We actually bring it right to the front of when a product starts to be. Once we know that this thing is going to be developed and it's going to probably go on for a while, we start looking at this readiness checklist. So it looks at things like, when the service breaks, what do you expect to happen as the owner of the service? Should someone pick it up at 3 o'clock in the morning, or is it okay to pick it up at 7? And we start to ask these questions early on. And as the product is developed and goes through iterations, we expect that more of these questions will be answered and more of them will turn green. What we found that by using patterns is that instead of having to go into depth into each of these questions, we can almost go, did you use the infrastructure pattern? Yes, wonderful, we can tick most of the boxes. Did you do something that was different to the pattern? Yes, okay. What's that specific thing that you did that was different to the pattern? And let's go and spend more time on that, because that's the thing that we're going to be unfamiliar with. That's probably the bit that's maybe it's more likely to break, or it's the bit that we need to do extra training on. So it means that we can assess service of readiness and how healthy it's going to be much more quickly if a team's used patterns. Now and again, there'll be some teams that don't, because there's a good use case, in which case it takes longer to go through this because they've got to start from the beginning. So it's not to say you can't do that, you can, but it will be slower, and that's the trade-off. So yes, we found product teams like using patterns. We weren't sure if it was going to be a little bit too constrictive when we started, but actually they really like that someone goes out of the box, here's something to get you going, and it answers most of the questions. And when I'm using these ideas of patterns, at the moment I talk about it mainly from an infrastructure perspective, but you could apply these in lots and lots of different contexts. So if this doesn't apply exactly to the field that you work in, I would just see whether it can be relatable, because I found that it works for quite a few things. So this idea that if you use a pattern, most of the boxes are ticked. If not, then it takes more work. It's a really good trade-off to incentivize people to use the pattern. And one of our success stories here with the patterns was we've built our patterns for AWS, and so we had those. Most of our products were built there, and then one product team says, actually we want to use Azure. And we thought, okay, we've not got any patterns for Azure, right? But what we did is we took the patterns that we had for AWS, we looked at them to say, actually, where is there consistency and where is there difference? And we found that there wasn't that much difference after all, and we could do some slight tweaks to make our infrastructure patterns sort of suitable for Azure. And as a result, we managed to create a service from idea to production-ready service on Azure, first one ever, in a month. Security tested, highly available, backed up across various regions in a month end to end. So that was like, we didn't expect we would be able to do it so easily, and there were some challenges, but it just showed that having some pre-built stuff that we could reuse was much, much quicker to do even things that weren't our normal set of tech. Next one was that applying patterns to organisational policies is really useful. I did this talk at another conference, and someone gave it the name as policy as code. I was like, I quite like that. That sounds like the title for the talk. So the idea here, and this is what it looks quite nicely actually to your talk, is our security policies, if you printed them out, they were these A3 spreadsheets, and it was about this thick. And I'm pretty sure that if you gave that to a developer, it would not have the intended consequences. It would be really hard to work out, how does this relate, how do I apply this to everything that I'm doing? What we did instead is we built as much as we could of that policy into our patterns. So in that infrastructure pattern, which actually translates to lots of code in Terraform, lots of things were built in, like user access policies, password policies, the ways that we should segregate environments. We built those into the code, so as long as you use the pattern, you were adhering to the policy without even knowing that you were. So this sort of got us away from the human error of forgetting to do it or having to assure it at the end as a load of work. If you build that in at the start, people use it without even realising that they're using it, and it doesn't solve all the problems, but it creates a better baseline. So that was quite nice, and I'll talk through what we're doing with change in a little bit, but that's another place where we're trying to embed our policies, things that people usually don't get quite right or misunderstand, embed that in things that are familiar. And when we've been audited, it's been really useful as well, because instead of having to go and look at every single product individually, what we've been able to do is to say, this is our pattern, and this is how the pattern fits the policies. We assure the pattern, and then if we find that there's something that's wrong, we know what we need to fix in every service going forward. Or if we've got it right, we know that that's probably right in every service, so it makes it a little bit quicker to get through that process. Last thing is, we're realising now that we might need multiple patterns. So I've been talking about how wonderful our infrastructure patterns are, and it helps us to do lots of things more quickly. But what we realised is that actually quite a lot of infrastructure, if someone wants to do something that's really tiny and it might not live for very long. So an example is, I just want to throw up a web page and get some user feedback on it. That's far too much infrastructure. It's way too complicated for something like that. So what we're in the middle of doing now is creating another sort of set of patterns for things that fall into that category where you just want to prototype something quickly, it's not collecting data, and we're going to use some patterns of Roku because it's much faster, we can give teams a bit more autonomy as long as it fits a set of constraints. So I think we'll start to see this develop as we go, that different sizes of things will need different patterns, maybe we'll link it to importance of service, so really critical services, you must use this pattern. If it's less critical, you can use different ones, but we don't want to create a catalogue of them because then it gets really hard to maintain. But we do think that there's a need for some different sizes. Now I'm going to talk about change management. Favourite topic. I can see a few smiles around the room. So change management, if for people that aren't familiar, is this idea of if you want to change a system, you should do some sort of risk assessment, you should schedule it at a time that makes sense, you should plan and test beforehand, and then you should assess how well it went. Usually the idea of change requests and CABs send a shiver up developers' spines because it just sounds awful, and so a few nods at the back, yeah. And then the idea of DevOps and developers being able to access production similarly sends a shiver up auditors' spines. So we've got these two worlds of like clashing ideas of what change management should be. And it's a bit of a shame because it's actually quite useful to have change management at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to work out why something broke. So some of our services, even though we've built them in the cloud, digital, we've tried to make them as sort of self-sufficient and contained as possible, some of them still do reach all the way through the organisation. So for example, it might take data feeds from a system that belongs to a different business unit that doesn't work in the cloud, that's got an on-premise system. Maybe it doesn't have code versioning, maybe it can't do an automated rollback on its last commit. It might not have all these lovely new features because it's quite old, but we're still interfacing with it. So we can't say, in our digital world doing DevOps, we can act in isolation because we've got all these nice new technologies that make it safe, because we're still interacting across these two worlds. So we need a process that's shared. However, the change process that was built at the co-op was very much built based on, I think, like a lot of processes. When things went wrong, we decided that we needed to add more things into the process to prevent that thing ever happening again. So the change form, which could maybe have started as 10 questions, is now 7 pages and asks lots of things that might not quite be relevant anymore. So it's grown over time based on what's happened with history. The second thing is we need to be able to have this visibility to look sideways and not just look at our own services, because we are interconnected, and it might be important that people outside of our business unit of digital can see what's going on. And I'll give some examples. And I think when you're in an enterprise company that has a lot of different systems and services, this is even more important. So very often when you hear about how do you do change management in DevOps, I've seen a lot of examples where they talk about a product team or a couple of product teams at a company, but they're actually all working on essentially one thing. Whereas in the environment that I'm in, you've got HR systems, finance systems, systems that are user-facing, systems that are customer-facing, there's data feeds going backwards and forwards, they've all been built on different technologies and different timelines. So the complexity of all these things interacting is definitely there a lot more, especially in older companies where it's matured a bit compared to a startup that's greenfield and started fresh. So here we have the typical problem that DevOps tries to resolve. We've got our product teams in green over on the left who want to develop new products and features for users. And then we've got the team that I look after on the other side, the ops team, and they care about making sure our services are reliable. And we have conflict because they've got different agendas. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You do need the tension between those two groups to hold each other to account. But this is the problem that DevOps tries to. So you get the ops team to understand the context of what developers do, you get the developers to understand the context of what operations do, and together you make better decisions understanding each other's world. But when you work in an enterprise company, there is the rest of the enterprise to think about, and they care about the reliability of not just your services, but all of the services that exist in that organisation. And they care about risk, and audit, and PCI DSS compliance, and all these other things. And so you kind of, like for my team in blue in the middle, we've got conflict almost on both sides. One wants to go faster and do more development and say, just trust us. And on the other side, we've got auditors going, this looks a bit wild, wild west if you're just going to, where's your documentation, where's your requirements? This is a world that's unfamiliar to me. So very often we have sort of like this conflict on both sides. And this is, I think, one of the challenges that a lot of companies have, that we've got developers who are learning new things and working in new ways and challenging the ideas, but we've not caught up with the processes that exist in organisations on the other side. And there's a little bit of a balancing act to figure out how these work together. So, area of conflict. And very often, one of the challenges I get is, we've created this digital service, it's in the cloud, it doesn't touch our on-premise data centres, so why do we have to use that same heavy change process for our little system over here when it's not connected? And I have a good story for this one. Most people usually hate major incidents and outages. I love them, they're strange people. Not the 3 AM wake-up calls, but I love the energy that you get when something breaks really badly and everyone has to come together and fix it. I think it's actually one of those things that brings teams together who don't normally come together. But the other thing that it gives you is you very quickly learn where the cracks are, and you very quickly learn what you don't know about the system that you're looking after. So this is an example which I use to just make people understand that you don't always know what you don't know, and you can't say that any deployment that you're doing over there is completely risk-free. So we made a change to the front end of our membership website, really small change, and it was just something that was a little bit different on the login journey. And alongside this tiny change, we made a change to how the login works. So when someone logged in, it would write 3 entries into the logs, and they should just be informational events. But that developer made a mistake and put them in as warning events. On its own, not such a bad thing. But at the time, our alerting and monitoring was a bit immature, and we had it set up such that every time a warning event is written into the logs, send an email. So that was every time someone logged in, 3 emails sent. Okay. Those emails actually went to a distribution list. That distribution list went to 15 people. Every person logs in, with the number of emails being sent, it's starting to rack up. And it wouldn't be too much of a problem on a normal day, except our marketing team just did an email campaign to 2 million people asking them to log in. And then suddenly I have the manager of the email team going, what did you just do? Why are all your team's email addresses queued up in our email system? We're about to fall over. What just happened? So really completely not connected change is we didn't do anything to the email system. But what we do is we just forced a load of traffic through a mistake that someone made, a small mistake, but it had that impact. The only way that he knew to ring me was that he went, okay, this started happening at 2 o'clock. What changes took place across the whole organisation at 2 o'clock? And why on earth a front-end change to a login journey would be related to this? He couldn't understand, but he was able to just go through, call everyone and go, what did you do? We rolled back the change, issue averted, but it was a near miss. It didn't take anything out, it was a near miss, but it just proves the point that when you've got lots of moving parts, sometimes you just need to be able to, at some point, take this bird's eye view. So it's quite important for our teams that even if they think that they're quite disconnected in an organisation, that you still have that ability to work in a different way, but be able to talk a little bit broadly. And it does still sometimes feel a little bit like this, doing change management in digital compared to the rest of the organisation. We are doing a lot more changes and releases, and our process is really, really heavyweight if we followed it to the letter. So we're starting to tweak it, and we're working with the teams that look after that process. But it was built for a different team, a different world, a different set of challenges to what we've got now. And some of the technology that we're using now in the cloud, it just gets rid of some problems that used to be there with on-premise systems. So for example, if our infrastructure is as code, we know that every server is identical. So we don't have the problem of having to do configuration management on every single server, because it's a different way of approaching the same problem. So we don't get servers that behave weirdly because server 3 is configured slightly different to server 2. They're all the same, we know that. And if it's not, we just shut it down and bring up a new one. So, things like you need to attach implementation plan and test results to every change. If we did that for the 25 changes a day, the implementation plan would just say, run the automated deployment job. And anything more is ridiculous, because you could go and look at the automated deployment job that runs in the same way every day to get the detail. So we're having to start to challenge these different ways of doing things, not to say that it's not right, it's just different now. We'll talk about some of the things we've done to make it faster. So I've talked about in policy as code, embedding the policies in our deployment pipelines. So one of the things that we got pulled up on in our audit is that our policy says there must be segregation of duties between development and production. And then it goes on to say developers cannot deploy to production. This is completely at odds with what we want to do with DevOps. We want the developers who write the code to put it into production and support it. They are the ones that deploy it. That's what we want to do. So we were suddenly against our policies as the co-op. Once we dug a little bit deeper, we thought, what risk is this actually trying to prevent against? Well, it's trying to prevent against the risk that someone on their own can deploy some malicious code, or you only need to compromise one person's account to deploy malicious code to production. So we thought, right, let's think of another way of doing this. How could we do it? So instead of going back to the world of saying different people have to do, like different teams or different role types have to do the different parts of the job, we actually put something in place. So our developers can deploy to production, but only if the deployment is done through an automated deployment job, and the configuration of that job, they shouldn't be able to change. So you need a different level of permission to be able to change that job. And we've added an extra step in the pipeline, so I'll just show you what it actually looks like in practice. So this is an excerpt from our Slack channel, and you can see that James at the top has kicked off the production pipeline for the multi-DAPI deploy. So he said, deploy to production. Then Jenkins asks a question that says, somebody else, who's not James, has got 30 minutes to press the button to say that they approve that deployment. And if they do, and you can see who it's done by, James requested it, Adam approved it, then it deploys. This sort of changes it a little bit from this idea of somebody else has to deploy my code. James still deploys his code, but he can't do it alone. He needs another person. So this doesn't mitigate against all risks. You could get two developers who are colluding and both want to deploy something malicious. But it does get away from it being quite so easy to do. You've got an extra hurdle that you need to get through to do that. So we've done this with one team. We've wondered how much impact it would have on their sort of ability to deploy, and so far people seem to like it. It works a little bit better than just approving merge requests, because it's happening at the point of deploying to production, because you could get someone approving a merge request early on and then it changing before it gets to production, so it gets around that. But it's just a slightly different way of thinking about how to get your segregation of duties requirements done. So now we're working with our...
What do your auditors have to say about that?
So we're working with them, sort of taking them through it. So they're happy with it in principle. The next step is to say, is this enough that we could put that as a method in our policy that would be okay? So it wouldn't be okay for all teams, like a certain number of conditions need to be true. So if there are things that, not every system is going to be suitable for this. So for example, it probably might not be okay in a situation where you've got regulation that expects something different, or it's in banking. But for some of our services, we want that something a bit lighter because the risk is less. But I would say it's a bit context dependent. So they're on board with a different approach. They understand it. The next step is to go, actually, is it that our policy wording is actually not quite right? And we should look at what risks we're actually trying to mitigate against, because I think the risk, the types of risks that are out there now are a little bit different, and the wording of what we were trying to do previously is a bit immature for what we've got. So I can let you know once we've gone through that. Another thing that we've done is We've got cross-skilled service managers aligned with product teams. So typically what you would have is your product team who work on a product, and then you'd have some core teams that sit separately. So service management might be one. We have a separate team that looks after business continuity, a separate team that looks after security, a separate team that looks after disaster recovery testing. All these teams typically sat outside of your product team. What we've tried to do now is actually align some of those roles into a product team. So they still belong in their sort of like their home team, but they're aligned to a specific product team, and they can move around. What this does is it gives that role, so you could say a service manager or a security individual, they get a bit more context of what's actually going on. So when we talk about change management, rather than change management being, I'm a person that's disconnected and I read this form, make an assessment based on this form, whether to approve or reject, they're actually in the product team and they're watching as the developers are talking about what's going to go on. They can ask the questions right at the start of that development to say, hang on, that sounds like we should probably get someone from security involved or data protection to just double check that that approach is okay. And those conversations are happening earlier in the process rather than at the point of, actually you can't deploy to production this afternoon because you didn't think of X, Y, Z. So we're trying to embed people so that they've got more context and take it away as from being just a checkbox exercise that happens before things go to production. Okay, so the last bit is around the conflicts of the different ways of working between our digital team, DevOps, continuous delivery, whatever you want to call it, and the rest of the organisation. So the worlds do look quite different, and even actually when you visit the different floors that the teams work on, they visually look quite different. We use lots of Kanban boards, post-its, there's whiteboards everywhere, and that's quite different to the other IT teams in the sort of like the traditional IT where I've worked. And so I think sometimes it's almost like there's two cultures. And when we have to work together, if the teams don't understand each other, that's where you get clashes and you get myths that start to arise, and you've got to address these things. And in our digital team, we had this luxury of starting from a clean slate. We had leadership that really backed the team to do something different, and we were starting fresh. We weren't having to find a way of looking at legacy systems. We were in the cloud. It was brand new territory, and that is a real luxury, and we recognise that. But that's also something that I think the teams that are having to struggle with an old system that's underfunded, they know that they can't upgrade it, but they really need to, and until they upgrade it, it's going to be a pain to look after. They see that new shiny world with all the technology and the auto-scaling and auto-healing infrastructure and nice deployment pipelines, and you can understand why there's a bit of a clash in teams looking over the fence and seeing that the grass is greener. So where we do have to work together now, it's really been important that we can share the learnings that we've got here and try to bring our colleagues that are still IT colleagues, still doing the same sort of stuff, but share with them what we can so that they can take some of our learnings into the world that they work in, recognising that it's a little bit different. So what we found mostly is the existing policies and processes that we've got, if we put them into place just out of the box, they feel like they don't fit, but the principles that underpin them still apply. So I think what we've got now is this journey of iterating them a bit and working with the team so that they realise that we're not just trying to be wild, wild west and run the world on post-it notes, but there is a different way of doing things, and how can we work together? So an example for this is we were talking about disaster recovery, and a lot of our ways of doing disaster recovery applied really well when we just had on-premise data centres, and disaster recovery meant failing over from one to the other. When you're in the cloud, that doesn't quite fit anymore, and actually there's many different ways that you could do disaster recovery. So what do we actually mean by disaster recovery? What's applicable to different services? How can we write something that means something to both of these different ways of working? Because the principles will be the same, but the actual putting it into action might be different. So we're creating these sort of working parties around different things where we discuss, these are the challenges we've got, these are the challenges we've got, these are the new things that we found. Oh, how can we apply that? Can you train me in that? And it's just starting to build these bridges that means that we're having less conflict, and overall everyone's learning. The teams that are doing new shiny stuff are understanding the problems that the teams working in the traditional on-premise IT have, and likewise, the people that were looking at the shiny new stuff over here aren't seeing us as adversaries anymore. They're seeing us actually, how can we leverage some of that and bring that into our world? So it's starting to come together, but I think it's going to be a bit of a long journey. And yeah, taking the time to share knowledge and develop relationships. It can feel like when you are trying to do lots of development, launch features, do this audit, do that resilience review, that security report, all these things can get very bogged down in just what's going on with your products and services. And actually this building communities and what you can leverage from that is something that sometimes gets sort of deprioritized against the hard technical stuff, but it's really important to have these ongoing conversations about how can we improve our ways of working as an organisation continuously. So I think that's it. Our top 3 takeaways, yeah. Embed your policies into patterns. Align ops with product teams. I'd probably go a little bit further actually and say, just commenting on yours, embed your security with product teams as well as operations. And work on building organisation-wide communities. And that's it. Any questions?
Just a quick one then about the term DevOps.
Oh no.
And am I right to summarise from that you use the term DevOps to mean a set of principles and ways of working? And if so, how do your developers work with your team to sort of own that from beginning to end?
So I think it means different things to different organisations because you can interpret it in very different ways. We've tried a few approaches. So we've tried having operations or service. So we have, if I take 2 flavours of role types that perform DevOps, we have what we call platform engineers, so they look after the infrastructure in the cloud and the bits that go around that, like firewalls and WAFs and CDNs. And then I have the service management team who sort of do everything in the incident management, change management, etc., etc. We've tried a few things of what happens if we embed a platform engineer in every team, and that's DevOps. And what happens if we embed a service person in every team? We've tried different things with different teams. Sometimes it works to have them embedded, and that feels like probably the... No, I was going to say that probably feels like the best way, but actually it really does depend on the team and what it needs and how healthy the system is and how healthy the team is. Because some teams absolutely care about what the operation is like. They care about trying to understand why is that data not looking like it should do, and they want to dig into it. Depends a bit, I think, around what the team is motivated by. Some other teams, you might need someone who's like an outside force, like this core service team that just keeps an eye on everything and notices that all the plates are spinning, but that one's a little bit wobbly, so we need to go and pay attention to that. And that's where having a team that's a little bit separate, doing the DevOps sort of work, they just dip in and out, but they don't need to be there all the time. So I think we're still figuring it out, and I don't think there's like one structure chart that makes sense. But if you think of it, it doesn't matter if I don't think we've got it or not got it. I think there's a bit of a scale of picking up principles and starting to work in certain ways. The tooling certainly plays a part because some bits of it only make sense once the tooling's in place to facilitate a certain way of working. But the tools on its own won't start to break down the silos. Don't know if that answers it.
Yeah, great.
I wonder if we could, I think I'm going to let you be the microphone volunteer.
Can I ask a question first? You had some really amazing sounding readiness checklists.
Mm-hmm.
Are they on the core digital blog? Because you've got loads of great stuff on that blog. Are they?
Do you know what? I will write a blog post about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
looking forward and looking back. Forward, are you sort of putting containers into operation at the moment? How successful and what containers are you using for that?
Okay, so this isn't my area of technical expertise. I'm not that technical, so I might lag a little bit.
Okay.
We are using them. On a few services, we started, so our publishing platform, originally we didn't use containers. Now we're doing version 2, and we are using containers. We're using Kubernetes, and we're still just working through some of the details. So what we've done is prototyped it a little bit. It's just going through that phase of iterating it and seeing what benefit does it bring. We had another team who also did a spike on what happened if we put this in containers, what difference does it make to its operability, to its cost. So I think that is the direction we'll go, not for everything, but there will be certain services that lend themselves a little bit better. So it's still quite early in the journey, but so far it looks quite promising.
Okay, and looking back, the transition from local PCs to putting it in the cloud, how about comms problems and stuff like that? Do you find it more reliable, less reliable?
Much better, much better.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question related to the culture change that DevOps has brought in. So traditionally, most of the enterprise organizations, as you rightly mentioned, were following the traditional approach, like waterfall, iterative, incremental. So I'm also with an organization which is moving towards more of DevOps. So how did Co-op deal with their strategy or approach related to testing? What's the DevOps model?
Testing the model?
Yeah.
Okay.
So how does the tester's role fit into the model? I know it's more of an automated testing, so the developers do most of the automated tests, so they cover it all. Do you still have an additional phase for testing, or is it all covered within the process before deployment?
So we've had a few different models. So when we launched membership, for example, it was a lot of interconnected systems. So at that point, we had dedicated testing. There was still automated testing, but there was a lot that needed manual testing as well. And that team owned all the testing. So we had a bit of a bottleneck for a while where all the different development teams had to put their changes through that central test team. What we changed to once we found that that wasn't working is we actually split up that test team and embedded them in the different teams. And what we've seen over time is that the testing has changed depending on the maturity of the product. So in the early stages, it tends to need a lot more, especially if it's got a lot of integration with other systems. Other services that we've got, the testing's a little bit more lightweight. So for example, the publishing platform, which is where our websites run from, we don't have any data that needs to be checked for integrity. It's not got any interfaces with other systems. So the developers do the testing themselves and write automated scripts. But they might need at different points to pull in testers, either to write those scripts and to interpret them, or because we're launching a feature that needs that. So it actually tends to fluctuate, and I think the role it's changed from having just a fixed tester in a team that just does testing. Everyone does a bit of testing, but the tester's the SME. So it feels like they're just influencing the rest of the team to build testing to everything that they're doing.
So probably the role can be taken as a bit of defining the acceptance criteria for...
Yeah. So actually we have a nice thing which we call it 3 amigos. So at the start of doing a new feature, that tester is one of the 3 people involved in deciding how we're going to approach this problem and what does that look like. So the testing is very much, it's not an afterthought, it's built in from the start. So they're guiding how the testing should go.
Thanks for answering. Yeah. Thank you.
Obvious question, if 3 amigos, who are the other 2?
Developer and product owner, maybe delivery manager. I think it depends. It might be a tech lead. It depends who's needed.
Any other question? All right, I may put in a tiny question then. Patterns are great. Design patterns easy to deploy, you might argue, because they are there and you're starting from there. how about checking for compliance with the pattern? So you just mentioned it is assumed that because we are using patterns, people will have a way of making error, if you like, and it will be easy to. But if there are rogue developers who have deviated from the pattern without recording it, are they always caught in time?
So I think the way it would be caught now is another individual would notice that something doesn't behave as it's expected to. So if something wasn't following a pattern, it would look strange. Now you could say that rather than that being a human that's noticing it, you could make it such that something is checking it.
Yes.
We're not at that maturity level, but there's no reason why that couldn't be the case.
That's brilliant. So if there are no further questions, let's move on to the next.